I will be discussing and analyzing the work Apollo and Daphne by Bernini. It was completed in 1625 and is currently housed at the Borghese Gallery in Rome, Italy. This museum is the former country home of the Cardinal Scipione Borghese. It is a huge estate surrounded by gardens, an aviary, and is near the Roman Zoo. The collection at the museum is 20 rooms spanned across 2 floors and contains works from as early as the 1st century AD until the mid-17th century. I visited here while studying abroad this summer and was truly in awe of the museum and the great works of Bernini, especially Apollo and Daphne. The work is based off of the ancient Greek myth of Apollo and the nymph Daphne. It's inspired by Book 1 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it recounts the day that Apollo was struck with an arrow from Cupid out of spite for teasing him and calling him too young a boy to be fit to handle such a weapon. The arrow caused Apollo to become madly in love with a passing river nymph named Daphne. Daphne was devoted to the goddess Diana and vowed never to marry and remain a virgin all her life. Daphne ran away from the lust-driven Apollo and called to her father, the river god, to help her. Daphne's father interceded by turning her into a laurel tree, and Apollo vowed that if she could not be his wife, then she would always be his tree, and she became a laurel tree. Apollo gave her eternal youth and adopted the crown of laurel leaves, which eventually became a symbol of Olympic victories and Roman emperors. Cardinal Scipione Borghese commissioned this work in 1622 in order to replace the Rape of Persephone, which he had given to Cardinal Ludovisi. Both the Rape of Persephone and Apollo and Daphne were done by Bernini. Bernini secured international fame for breathtaking beauty, innovative composition, and technical virtuosity. He was a sculptor around the Baroque period, so this was more of a focus on revamping the Catholic Church post-Protestant Reformation. And so the Church commissioned a lot of art that would captivate attention, stimulate the senses, and elevate the soul. So most Baroque works are massive, dramatic, and theatrical, and it can definitely be told by looking at Apollo and Daphne that Bernini is able to take into account those 3 major aspects of Baroque art. And as we discussed in class, I think it is also pretty relevant to talk about how after the Baroque period, the Neoclassicism period came around, and that was sort of able to take away a lot of the fame and fortune from Bernini's artwork. But recently, in the 20th century, the artwork from the Baroque period was rediscovered, and that artwork has been able to have a new take on life and be viewed in the same way it was back in the 1600s and 17th century. So in order to start this off as a document, I want to ask the viewer to take a moment and look at the art. What do you see? What are some things that come to mind viewing it in the aspect of the Baroque period? So 3 things that come to mind when viewing the artwork, I believe, would be drama, movement, and narrative. So speaking about drama, I told you all the story of Daphne and Apollo. This work of art captures the most dramatic scene of the story. So it is where Daphne becomes a tree, and if you look at the statue, the bark is coming up from the ground, engulfing Daphne from the feet up to her hip. It's leaving branches sprouting from her fingers and hair. It's a very dramatic scene, all happening in one piece of stone. Going off the piece of one stone, we can talk about movement here and talk about something that differentiates Bernini from other previous artists, which is the fact that he captures a fast-moving scene in a stoic single piece of marble. So many of his works are famous for this, where his figures are either speaking or screaming. And one thing I like to notice and point out here is Daphne's mouth in the image. She has her mouth open, and personally, I like to believe that she is still pleading with her father, begging for him to somehow get Apollo away from her. And she is so just riled up at the moment that she doesn't understand that she's being turned into a tree. And also within movement comes motion, and Bernini is able to use implied motion here, where he is able to use a stoic piece and be able to imply that something is happening. And because a lot of people know the story, they understand at which point of the story this is occurring. However, by using such dramatic and theatrical representations of motion, Bernini is able to not only imply but force the viewer to understand that motion is occurring at the moment within this piece, which is a very interesting thing that he is able to do. So many sculptures are meant to be viewed from only one angle, but however, in the case of Apollo and Daphne, the narration is meant to be viewed from all angles. From the rear of the statue, only one can see Apollo and the tree. However, when you move forward around to the front of the statue, you're able to see the faces of Daphne and Apollo, and you are able to understand the point of the story through their facial expressions, which is something that Bernini, as I mentioned earlier, is very well known for doing. The original placement of the statue was meant to be on the wall adjacent to a nearby chapel. However, towards the end of the 18th century, the statue was moved to its current place in the middle of the room. The original placement of the statue is where Bernini and Scipione Borghese intended the statue to be viewed from. Where the statues reside in the museum is referred to as the Apollo and Daphne room. It is the third room in the entire Borghese. So personally, for me, the statue can only be viewed in relation to the museum itself, because within this room, the Apollo and Daphne room, there are many other paintings, busts, and statues that refer to other Ovid stories from the Metamorphoses, but more specifically, a lot of images that refer to the story of Apollo and Daphne. So another piece that I find interesting is juxtaposition within the room. So directly above the statue Apollo and Daphne by Bernini is a painting by the painter Pietro Angeletti, and it is called Cupid Strikes Apollo with the Arrow of Amorous Passion, while Daphne is struck by another one with the opposite effect. So one really interesting thing is that this painting is sort of more towards the beginning of the story, but yet shows the progression of the story through looking at the top of the ceiling and moving on down and looking at the statue by Bernini. One is able to sort of see the story over the course of your gaze from looking up at the ceiling and seeing Daphne eventually turn into the tree. So in conclusion, I really hope you enjoyed the video. I wanted to teach more about something that I was able to see in person and have more of an experience with. Therefore, I think I was able to give y'all, the viewers, a better and more in-depth understanding of the work of art. And in summary, what we've been able to see is that Bernini is one of the greatest Italian Baroque sculptors from the 17th century. He was able to use drama, movement, and narration within this work of art in order to capture a very dramatic story and put it in the viewer's eyes and have them experience it on another sensory level. However, it is not only just the work of art that we need to be taking into account. However, we also need to take into account the beautiful Borghese Gallery, which contains a room fully devoted to the subject of the statue. Therefore, within that room, you are surrounded by many representations. However, you are able to see all different aspects of the story, like I said earlier, from the ceiling. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you learned a lot.